Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Advances in Autism Research and Care webinar. We're thrilled to have you. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started. First, we'll leave some time at the end for a question and answer for our presenter. So you should see on the dock on your screen, there is a question section. You can type in your questions. Then I will have the chance to read them out to the presenter at the end. Secondly, if you know anyone who missed the presentation, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded, and the link will be sent out to our network YouTube channel. So without further ado, I have Dorothea Yanuzzi here, who is our network postdoc fellow, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Yes, hello. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Lindsell, who's a collaborative biostatistician who's the leader in application of rigorous and biostatistical methods in the acute care environment and to the intersection between emergency care and public health. He's led data coordinating centers for numerous multi-center clinical trials, including FDA-regulated trials and for epidemiological studies. He holds patents on risk stratification in septic shock, and he has contributed significantly to a number of NIH-funded networks. His current focus is on learning health systems, leveraging clinical processes and data systems to enhance learning from pragmatic trials and observational studies, and for designing and implementing dissemination and implementation research. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. If at any point during the conversation, if anybody cannot hear me, I will be keeping an eye on the chat box, but I do believe the audio should be working well. So without further ado, I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about pragmatic trials, what they are, why we do them, how they're different to traditional trials, and really getting to the root of how do we generate a real-world evidence that will inform real-world practice. So the first question that we're going to address today will be, what is a pragmatic trial, and why are they different? How are they different to how we normally think about research? And then I'll introduce you to a tool called PRAC2. And it's a tool that can help to design or to evaluate or to think about pragmatism or practicality in designing trials. I will comment a little bit on regulatory components. I promise I'm not going to talk about the details of Department of Health and Human Service regulations or federal codes. We're really just going to mention the role of consent in a pragmatic trial and how important that is. And then finally, I'll briefly talk about the cost considerations and how they differ. If we have time, we'll go into a little bit the different kinds of study designs that can go into pragmatic trials, primarily to help introduce you to terminology that's used and try to demystify some of the language that researchers tend to use to blind people to the truth that these things really aren't that difficult. They just like to use big words to describe it. And then finally, we'll kind of come back to the Q&A, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you have. As I go through this talk, as the introducer very kindly said, my focus is very much on acute care and critical care. And so I apologize if any of the examples I use are a little bit off. But hopefully I'll be able to keep them in a domain that is of interest to you. And if anybody would like to give me better examples as we go forward, I'm happy to take and run with any of those. So to begin with, the first question is, what is a pragmatic trial? It is not an excuse to do a bad study. So I do a lot of work with journals where people are trying to present their results. And the reviewers come back and they say, you know, why didn't you collect this data? Or why didn't you actually include a control group? And they often come back with the answer, well, it was because we were doing a pragmatic trial. Pragmatic is not replaceable with bad. A bad study is not a good thing. Really, what a pragmatic trial is It's a study that uses really good scientific methods, but it's designed in a different way. It's designed to generate real-world evidence in a real-world setting. And we'll go through exactly what that means. In traditional trials, traditional research really does generate really good information about whether or not a treatment or intervention actually works. But it does it in very idealized situations. And we refer to those kinds of trials as efficacy trials. Pragmatic trials are a little bit different. We're trying to provide information on whether the intervention or the treatment works in real practice. It's more of an effectiveness study. Just as an example, in an oncology trial, the medications are given as prescribed, and they might demonstrate tumor responsiveness, so that the tumor shrinks in response to the treatment. But in reality, in practice, when the new drug is used by patients, we find that there's no tumor responsiveness. And we might question, well, why is that the case? And the reality is that the drug is producing too many side effects. It's causing some numbness and tingling in the fingertips. It causes a little bit of nausea, and the patients just choose not to take the drug. And so while the drug might have efficacy, we know that it shrinks a tumor. It doesn't have effectiveness because in the real world, patients naturally choose not to take the drug. They would prefer not to have the side effects and instead allow the tumor to grow. And that's the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. So if we think about the setting of where we're working, in efficacy, we're trying to control a bunch of stuff and see if the drug works. In effectiveness, we're really trying to see if interventions or treatments work in the real world. So if we think about this a little bit more, the traditional efficacy trials, they're sometimes called explanatory trials. The traditional efficacy trials, it's really the experimental truth. If I do something in very, very controlled situations, if I have a new cognitive behavioral therapy and I implement it in a very strict way, do I see a difference? Whereas a pragmatic or an effectiveness trial is much more, what is the truth in real life? And part of our goal is to really move from the experimental truth and generalize from that to what will happen in real life. Scientists often use the words internal validity and external validity. In the experimental truth domain, that we do find efficacy. We have the truth as to whether or not the drug actually works in a very precise controlled environment. Internally, that's extremely valid. But externally, it doesn't apply to the real world. And so in pragmatic trials, what we're aiming for is this truth in real life or this external validity. We don't tend to like pragmatic trials an awful lot in the scientific domain. And the reason that we tend to avoid them is because it is very, very difficult to understand the truth when it's looked at from many, many different directions. And reality is a little bit confusing. Two people looking at the same problem from a different direction may take a very different action. And in pragmatic trials, we have to put a real lens on things, and we can't say it's 4 or it's 3. We have to accept that it might actually be both, and that there's a way to deal with that and handle it. And it's really important that we do this work. It's important that we move from the efficacy studies, the internal validity, into the external validity domain. Going back, these are all quotes from high-tier manuscripts that have been very, very well referenced over time. Going back 50 years. 50 years ago, it was recognized that you might have a randomized controlled trial of a new treatment or a new approach, a new educational modality, a new cognitive behavioral therapy, a new mindfulness treatment. But the randomized controlled trial and the benefit observed there is very, very different to what we see out in the community. Again, the trial shows what can be accomplished under careful observation and restricted conditions, but the real results in the real world are very, very different. And it's one of the concerns I have with a scientist is that as we produce evidence, we create hope. We create hope for people who are looking for treatments. They're looking for solutions to problems. But unfortunately, if I'm only doing the efficacy work, that hope is a far away from the reality. And that was why I really became very interested in pragmatic trials. And how do we move from a world where there's great internal validity to a world where there's external validity? I kind of like this cartoon because it explains on the left how people think about this. A lot of very strict trialists and drug developers and others say, you know, we have to really control everything, all of the things that would confound our observations. Because if we don't do that, then we can't trust our results. And then on the other side, people who are more interested in pragmatism say things like, well, you might have a more reliable result, but it doesn't mean anything. It only means something if we can translate it to the community. Now, one solution to this is just to do two kinds of studies. We do the standard randomized controlled trial, and then we do something that has only external validity. My proposal is to challenge that and say, let's do a good pragmatic trial. A good pragmatic trial should have both internal and external validity and allow us to draw conclusions about whether or not our approach is going to work in the real world. Pragmatic trials are difficult. They're difficult to think about. And it's really, really challenging to design a study in that real world, that confusing real world where somebody sees a 4 and somebody sees a 3. It's difficult to design a trial that will produce an internally and externally valid answer. Fortunately for me, there is a group called the Pragmatic group. They have developed some guidance, some guidelines that help us to think about what does it mean to do a pragmatic trial. And I'm going to walk us through these guidelines. And I think that they're very useful at opening our eyes about what can this actually do for us? What can pragmatic trials do for us? And how does it change the way we think about research? So at a very high level, the Pragmatic folk have developed this toolkit. And this toolkit allows us to design a pragmatic trial that is really fit for the right purpose. The first question is why are we doing the trial? If we're doing the trial because we don't know there's any evidence a drug has even the potential, smallest potential of working in the lab, then we shouldn't be doing a pragmatic trial. But if the purpose is to see whether or not something works in reality, we're absolutely on the right pathway. The next thing we do is we start thinking through several different domains of practicality and how we design our trial within those domains. And we're going to walk through an example to help us visualize that. The Pragmatic people have developed a mechanism that we can score so we can see how close we are to pragmatism. And then we can use that to go through the design cycle and move from what we traditionally design as an efficacy trial into something that is much more pragmatic to do. So the domains that we're going to walk through, the 9 domains, eligibility, so who can be in the trial, recruitment, how you find them, the setting, where you do the study, the organization, what resources, what infrastructure you need to do it, the flexibility in what you do and how you do it, how you follow up, what you measure, and how you analyze the data, all talk to the practicality. They're all equally important, which is why when the Pragmatic people talk about it, they put this information on a wheel. And again, that will come clear in a little bit when we actually develop a wheel for the study that we're looking at now. So this is the example that I'm using. I hope it's not inappropriate, but essentially the idea is that mindfulness can be very helpful in many domains. And one of the areas that I do work in is traumatic brain injury. And we're finding that if we take an informal caregiver of a traumatic brain injury survivor and we expose them to mindfulness coaching, it helps to decrease their stress levels. It increases their ability to cope with the challenge of taking care of the TBI survivor. And so in this example, I'm suggesting the use of mindfulness to manage stress and burnout in parents of children with autism spectrum disorder. So on the first step of the pragmatic pathway, we asked the question eligibility. If I was designing an explanatory trial, if there was no evidence as to whether or not mindfulness was at all beneficial, I would probably choose a very defined patient cohort or participant cohort. I would control the amount of stress and anxiety in the individual environment of the person involved. And I would also try and find a way to ensure that I'm not including in my study people who wouldn't necessarily respond. There are 150 different things that I might control, but essentially what I would try and do is get my participants to look as alike to each other as I can, and also participants who I think that I can really change the most. If I'm doing a pragmatic trial, I'm not going to make limitations. I'm not going to focus on just a few. I'm really going to include any parent of any child. To me, that's important because in reality, we care about everybody. On the second step of the pragmatism scale is recruitment. This is how we go out and we find participants to be in our study. For our standard clinical trials, I might have a research coordinator who I have go through the medical records or the charts. They find participants. They might send a letter. They might call that person. They might hang out in clinic and meet with people when they come into the clinic. And then that coordinator might go through a customized e-consent process that walks the participant through the entire study and helps the participant feel comfortable. The reality is that doesn't mirror real life. In real life, we don't select our participants in this way, we don't recruit them in this way, and we don't screen them in this way. What we might do is something very different. We might just say, you know, whenever a parent comes to a clinic with their child, we'll invite them to a mindfulness coaching session. And that might be as simple as that. That would be our recruitment tactic. Now, you can see very clearly that on the left-hand side in the explanatory space, we're really taking a lot of energy and effort to focus things. On the right-hand side, the pragmatic, we're really looking at, you know, what would happen in reality if we just offered a whole bunch of people some mindfulness coaching? Do we get some benefit? The next element of pragmatism is the setting. Where do we do the work? In the carefully controlled explanatory lab-based environment, we might actually invite our parents into a very controlled center for well-being where you know, you walk in and the environment has the appropriate colors and smells and lights and soothing environments and it's a very controlled space. Very different to what will probably happen in the real world, which would be mindfulness coaching done in a clinic. It might be sessions done at the local library, or could even be done by phone or using a smartphone app. You know, that some of the choices there are study design choices, but as we think about the pragmatic side, you know, we really can't have an entire population of people that we care about attending, you know, the Awesomeness Center for Wellbeing on a routine basis. It's just not feasible. It's not going to occur. And so in the pragmatic trial, we want to mirror real life as much as we can. You know, as far as the organization goes, in the explanatory trial, I'll be investing heavily in my research coordinator and my project managers. They'll be calling the participants, ensuring they show up. I might provide transport, healthcare transport. I might provide childcare so that the parents are offloaded for their experience. And then I might provide other things that are totally outside the normal base of clinical care to help reinforce the study intervention. They'll be very different to the reality where I may just be able to offer 2 or 3 scheduled sessions a week at the local library by a mindfulness coach. And that's pretty much what my organization is, because that would reflect what I can afford to do in practice. On the flexibility side, there are 2 elements of flexibility. The first is the delivery. In my very controlled environment, I really want to make sure that there is absolute control. So every participant might get 1 hour of coaching every week at a time and place that the participant's choosing, to ensure that they get that exactly 12 weeks of intervention, 1 hour per week, very controlled, so that I know what the exposure to the intervention is. In my pragmatic domain, I'm thinking a little bit differently. I'm thinking, well, participants are going to be able to attend as few or as many sessions as they're able. You know, life happens, and we need to be able to flex around that life. And so rather than try and force people into a time and a place and exclude them or remove them or eliminate them from a study if they're not able to just show up every now and then, that allows me to include them in the study. So any participant who shows up in the right place at the right time is going to be exposed to the intervention. And any participant who can participate at all, I'm going to include. Again, it speaks to what we're going to see in the real world, which is people will do what they can, and they will participate how they can. But you can begin to see the pragmatic environment is a lot more crazy and chaotic. And so if you think about the publication on which people will base their practice, it's going to be a lot harder for them to understand what was done in the pragmatic world than the explanatory world. But at the same time, they're also going to believe much more closely the results. The other element of flexibility is adherence. It is how you ensure that every person in the study gets the intervention that you expect. In our explanatory trial, we may go as far as to, if the patient or the participant doesn't show up, the coordinator might show up at the patient's house and start delivering the intervention there. Whereas on the pragmatic side, we really do allow things to be very free. In the explanatory world, if I'm in a drug trial in the explanatory world, I really wouldn't be allowed to give to take over-the-counter medications or other medications. I would have to control my co-interventions. I wouldn't be able to participate in other activities that might interfere with the drug that I'm testing. But in the real world, I want to know, does my intervention work in the presence of all of the noise? Does my intervention work more than the noise itself? Just a couple more domains that we want to run through before we kind of put this into a visual format. So we've talked about how we recruit people, how we find people, how we expose them to an intervention differently. How we make measurements is also going to be different in the 2 types of trial. In an explanatory trial, we might do very detailed questionnaires that measure well-being, stress, anxiety, burnout. I might also ask questions about, well, did you like the program? Would you do this again? How did you feel having to travel? Things that might inform a later implementation, but really have nothing to do with whether or not the program worked. And I might also take extreme measures to ensure that I have follow-up on everybody. This is different to the pragmatic space, where I might just have a 6-question burnout scale asked at the beginning and at the end of the intervention period, And I might just use something like the electronic portal to the medical record. We call it MyChart. And it's just the way patients might communicate with their doctors. We can send a survey through that. We might use a cell phone-based app to just do a quick survey. We could use a quick telephone survey, but keeping it short, keeping it sweet, keeping it simple means I get the measurement as to whether or not my treatment worked. And it's a measurement that matters to the participants, and it's something that I can use, but it doesn't really get invasive, and it doesn't become difficult to collect. The measurement that I'm making should also be very clearly associated with something that the patients care about. In the explanatory trial, I may not actually measure what the patient cares about. If I go back to the concept of cancer, we often measure tumor progression. And while that is important for patients, what patients really care about is quality of life and survival. And so if I'm measuring tumor progression using complex radiology techniques and MRI scans that have to be done at a special center, versus calling a patient and say, how do you feel? Are you doing okay today? It's a different kind of outcome. And in the pragmatic world, we really care more about the patient-centered, patient-focused primary outcome that is easy and relevant to measure. And then the last piece is how we analyze the data. One of the things that I was taught very early when I went to school was, if you want to find out if a drug works, you have to eliminate all of the noise. And so when you do your analysis, you remove anybody who did something that wasn't quite according to protocol. And then you adjust for all of the variables that could cause noise in your data. And at the end, you're left with the true efficacy signal of what is the maximum amount your drug could work in a very controlled environment. That's very different to, let's just include everybody and see overall, did we have an effect? In other words, on the left-hand side, I'm saying, if you do exactly what I say and exactly the way that I say it, am I likely to see a difference? On the right-hand side, what I'm saying is, if I start this new program and I give you the opportunity and I invite you to participate and you do or you don't, you engage, I'm going to see if in general, people feel better. People have lower burnout, have less stress or anxiety at the end of the study. So it's a much more intent to treat, not actual treatment. And I do simple comparisons. And in this way, the way that I'm answering the question is, if my clinic, my physician, my city were to invest in this program, do I see a benefit? Do I see a change? The visual on the screen now is the pragmatic wheel that I mentioned earlier. And you'll see around the outside, each of those elements, those 9 elements are positioned. And you'll see there's also a scale that runs from 1 to 5, where 1 is something that is completely impracticable, but is very, 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 very controlled. Whereas a 5 is something that is extremely pragmatic, very practical, and takes no real energy to do. And the way we use this is we map our study onto the wheel. If we think about the study that we just talked through, we had very controlled eligibility criteria that were difficult to find, and so it scores very poorly. Our way of finding patients was a little bit tough, and so it scores poorly. Our setting was a well-being center. Well, that's not quite as tough as some places, and one might think that a well-being center is an okay place to do a mindfulness intervention, and so it scores a little bit better. The organization, the flexibility, those really weren't all that practical either, so they score poorly. The follow-up, just doing simple surveys, that's not as bad as doing MRIs or making patients come to see a physician for a checkup, so that scores a little bit better. On this particular study, the outcomes that we talked about, the stress, burnout, anxiety outcomes, I think those are pretty relevant to participants. So even though there's a lot of them and it's difficult to get them all, they were relevant. So the study scores reasonably well. On the primary analysis, our goal was to exclude everybody who didn't do everything exactly right. And so it's really not very pragmatic. If we look at this as a pragmatic trial, we get a very different picture, and you can see the shape and size of the map overlay. In our pragmatic trial, we said everybody can be a part of it. We did have to recruit people. We did have to invite people to take part, so it's not a perfect 5, but it's close. As far as the setting, we really couldn't do this in a patient's home, and we couldn't make it really easy for them. There was some travel required, so it's better than terrible, but it's not awesome. Organization, we still have to provide a mindfulness coach. We still had to provide a location. We had to schedule things and set things up. So there's, again, it's not perfect, but it's getting there. But then the flexibility, the follow-up, the outcome, and the analysis, we designed to be as pragmatic as possible. And because we took all of these steps, our trial is as close to reality as we could get it. It's as practical and as pragmatic as we could get it. So again, just to reiterate the process, we asked the questions: why are we doing the study? Is it an explanatory study? Or is it pragmatic? Are we trying to get external validity? Are we trying to show real-world evidence in the real-world settings? And if we are, let's run down the other steps. We use those 9 domains. They're really helpful for us to think about trials. And even when we're reading about new treatments that we discover that might benefit us, our families, our lives, even when we're reading about those, we can think about these 9 domains and say, did this match my life? Did this match reality? And if it doesn't, then it doesn't mean the drug didn't work. It just means that you have to interpret the results thinking that it's the maximum effect that you see, not the total effect across a broad group of people. The scoring system helps us to think about where on the scale our individual domains fall. And when we look at the wheel, if we're seeing something like this, we might be very positively disposed to saying that's a real-world study providing real-world evidence, and I can hang my hat on, if I just implement this program, I'm going to get some benefit. But if we're seeing this, we're saying this is a really tightly controlled situation. I'm not sure if we do this in reality, we're going to see the same thing. So I want to talk very briefly about the monetary aspects. This is something that researchers always ask, and they say, well, if I don't have to pay a coordinator, and I don't have to pay an interventionist, and I don't have to pay participants, and I don't have to pay for clinic time, and I don't have to do blood draws, are these trials free? And the answer is no, they're not free. We still have to resource them, but it looks very different. This is a schematic diagram that we developed that really describes where the relative expenses go. There are no real dollars here because every trial is a little bit different. But in terms of relative spend, we think that this is a pretty good example. The randomized controlled trial, the explanatory trial, and the pragmatic trial really take the same amount of time from the researcher. It's pretty hard to design these things, and it's hard to keep them going, and it's hard to interpret them and report them. And so there's no savings to the investigator. For the research coordinator, the person whose boots are on the ground doing enrollment, the patient engagement, the cost is substantially reduced in the pragmatic trial, because I really don't need that person to be spending all of their time interacting with participants, enrolling patients, or collecting data. Those people are really organizing the clinics and the people who are doing the normal healthcare, and just training them to integrate the research into practice. IT support is generally more expensive. And that's because I'm integrating my clinical or my research stuff into either the medical record or into how I'm going to collect my data at the end of the day. I might do, for example, a pragmatic trial where whether or not you are exposed to a mindfulness coach is randomized. And that randomization might come not at a cluster level, which I'll talk about briefly, but because in the medical record, we do a randomization. I have to pay the programmers in the medical record to do that randomization for me, so my IT support goes up. It might be that for every patient in my study, the health system records a quality of service or a satisfaction survey 9 months or 3 months or 2 months after the healthcare experience. And I just want to access that data as my primary outcome. And if I'm doing that, I have to pay IT people to get it. And so my IT support does go up in a pragmatic trial relative to a usual trial. My data management, however, does not. It's about the same. The costs of enrolling go way down because I'm integrating my eligibility, my screening, and my recruitment into usual processes. And I'm really trying to minimize the energy, the activation energy of enrollment. And so my costs go down with that. If I'm doing a drug trial with a pragmatic approach, typically I'm not doing an FDA regulated trial where I have to provide the drugs. I would be using standard of care drugs, and I would be comparing between 2 treatment standards. And because of that, insurance typically picks up the cost, and I don't have to pay for it as a study. There are some caveats, and it's not always the case. But generally, if I'm designing a pragmatic trial, in part I'm doing it because I want to know what works in the real world, and I know that non-FDA approved and understudied drugs aren't really going to work in the real world yet. And so I keep those costs and that focus in my more explanatory studies. Here I'm looking at 2 things that might be known to work, and I'm just comparing them. And so assuming that either insurance or some other mechanism would pick up the cost of the drugs. And then finally, the analysis. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the real world is a confusing place. And we often use biostatistics as a way to tease the truth out of reality. And so trying to find whether it was 4 or 3 or whether it was 3.5, the biostatistician is going to be doing that at the end. And typically it's a little bit harder to analyze these than it is for a traditional trial. So overall, the dollars are a little bit different. I will give you a sense of this for a very real study. Here we conducted a pragmatic trial. Patients who go to an ICU are often given fluids. We hear on TV shows and on the radio, hang saline, give the patient fluids, needs resuscitation. There are 2 big types of fluids that people use. One is saline or normal saline. It's just a salty solution. And the other one is a special solution that's been manufactured so that it mirrors much more what's in the blood itself. And so we're really either adding just a little bit of salt water or a little bit of this balanced fluid into a patient's bloodstream to give them what they need to be able to survive a challenging situation. The 2 fluids, they cost the same. They are used pretty much interchangeably, but there is some potential that the two different fluids could cause a difference. Because the 2 fluids are very, very cheap, they're both made by the same company, there's really no incentive to do any kind of clinical trial. So we did a pragmatic trial where we randomized patients to getting the salt water versus the balanced fluid. We managed to randomize 30,000 patients over the course of a year or so, and we found that there was nearly a 1% difference in mortality. So if we can imagine that patients in the ICU have maybe a 15% mortality rate, about 15 patients out of 100 die, we saved 1 life out of 100 out of 30,000 patients. If we scale that up, a transition from salt water to balanced fluids just in mass could save more lives than curing diabetes. Massive trial, very, very small effects, a lot of biostat effort, data management to get there. To give you a sense of the costs to do that, if we had done it as a randomized controlled trial with traditional consent, we estimate it would have cost about $90 million. 30,000 patients, $90 million. We did it as a pragmatic trial. We estimated it cost us $279,000. 90 million to 279,000. The investigator effort was about the same. Data management effort was about the same. All the savings were in the coordination, enrolling patients, not paying for the drugs, a huge difference. And we found an answer that was very, very valid. And that leads me to think about regulatory considerations. The idea of doing research where we minimize the consent burden makes us start thinking, well, what about consent at all? If we're just comparing 2 drugs that we know work, or 2 programs of intervention that we think are both effective and are both out there in the literature or that have been tried in practice and we think they work, do we really need to get a patient's consent? If we think about it this way, if I'm in a hospital and I just choose to change the soap that I buy, do I need to ask the patient? And if I don't need to ask the patient if I'm just going to change the soap that I buy, do I need to ask the patient if I'm going to change the soap randomly to see which soap works better? And that's a very difficult question in pragmatic research. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but it's an important one to consider. Because the need for consent really affects practicality and it affects inclusivity. I'm not sure how many people have either given consent, obtained consent, or written consent documents, but these can be very horrible documents that are 15, 20 pages long, full of small text, that are not necessarily helpful to the idea of informed consent. But we know that if the study itself meets this criteria of no more than minimal risk, and it's impracticable to do the research without the waiver, we can request a waiver of consent. What does that really mean? It's difficult because different IRBs and different institutions think of this differently. The written rule, is that something that has the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life, then it might be considered minimal risk. Now, this is very difficult to come down as black or white. If we are comparing 2 care standards, let's say, for example, we wanted to compare cognitive behavioral therapy for weight loss versus cognitive behavioral therapy plus health coaching for weight loss, we might consider that those are 2 normal things. And so we would just say this is comparing 2 care standards. And so we could make an argument that is minimal risk. But in the example I just gave you of the 2 fluids, the difference that we observed was in mortality. And one might argue you're just comparing 2 frequently used fluids for which there is no rhyme or reason as to why a choice used to be made. But if the outcome is mortality, how can you say that the risk of one drug over the other is not greater than the risks that you would encounter in daily life? It's a really difficult line to walk. And we always recommend that we engage the participants, the patients, and the stakeholders in this particular determination. And we have good conversations with the regulatory bodies, the IRB, because it is difficult. Now, if we find that our study meets this determination, then we are really very much able to take advantage of this and either waive the consent or use a modified consent process. To give you an example of a modified consent process, I just mentioned a study that might compare cognitive behavioral therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy plus health coaching for weight management. It might be that to get consent for patients to be randomized to one or the other, we could integrate the consent into the usual consent for treatment. And so in the consent for care, it might say something to the effect of, during the process of care, there are some things that we don't know are better than others. And we would like your permission when those things occur to randomize you to one or the other so that we can learn what makes most sense and other patients can benefit the most. And that would be a modified consent process. So I'm going to skip through the designs relatively quickly and leave a couple of minutes for questions. And I'm going to run through the different kinds of randomized trials and talk about something called an implementation study. People often talk about translational research, and they talk about T1 to T4. And T1 translational research is really stuff that is done in test tubes in the laboratory and is just beginning to think about how do we change human health by understanding this molecule and understanding this molecule in experimental models. At the next step, once we start doing treatments, the first in human, we get these efficacy studies that we talked about, those studies that have internal validity, and those studies that are very, very well controlled. And we really need to understand efficacy before we can start doing these later stage translation, which is how do we see if these things work in the real world? Are they effective? And then once we've demonstrated that they're effective, how do we get people to do the right thing? One of the things that we know for a long time is that mindfulness reduces stress and anxiety in a large cohort of patients and patient caregivers. And yet we don't see a lot of programs that implement mindfulness and teach mindfulness. That brings in the domain of implementation research. And a lot of pragmatic trials are really focused on this implementation question of how do we get providers and patients to do the right thing, or the thing that we know is effective. And that really requires a real world setting and real world evidence generated in real world settings. I bring this up because many people talk about implementation science and effectiveness research in the context of pragmatic trials. And it's important to understand the pipeline. Once a drug or a new, a theoretical intervention has been shown to have internal validity and efficacy, then we want to do pragmatic trials to demonstrate effectiveness. And then we want to continue with our pragmatic trials that are really how to change provider and participant behavior so they're doing the right things. And the kinds of things that we measure in these different trials are very different. In the effectiveness trials, we really are intervening at the clinical level, at the patient level or the practice level, but we're measuring the outcomes at the level of the patient. We're randomizing often at the level of the patient, and our outcomes are often patient-reported outcomes. It's like stress or burnout. That's a little bit different to implementation. In implementation, we may have exactly the same design of study, but instead of measuring whether or not our health coaching or our mindfulness coaching reduced anxiety or burnout, we might be measuring whether more people took health coaching and mindfulness coaching using a cell phone app versus a telephone versus attending a local library session. And that would tell us what's the best way to get the best effective treatment to the most people in the most effective way. So with that, I'll circle back to how I started and ask the question, what is a pragmatic trial? Really, a pragmatic trial is a study that uses very sound scientific methods that's designed to generate real-world evidence in a real-world setting. And if you leave today's conversation with nothing else, it is that definition and the link to the PRAC2 website, which is an incredibly useful tool to start thinking about pragmatism in clinical research, and useful for evaluating new programs and whether they apply to you or your patients, and to designing trials that you may want to do that will affect more lives than others. So with that, I'm open to questions and answers.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much on behalf of our audience and our network to Dr. Lindsell for the presentation. The first question we had was, is it more difficult to receive grant funding to conduct pragmatic trials as compared to traditional RCTs?
It used to be harder, and what we've discovered is that of the many thousands of drugs that have been developed and have efficacy data, they're not being used, and they're not being used in the real world, in part because of implementation problems, but mostly because of the pragmatic trial problems, that people haven't done the work to say, does this drug work in general in the real world? And so the federal government is spending more and more money every day on the pragmatic trials. They have very specific programs of pragmatic trials and implementation research, and we're seeing a much higher uptake of this work.
Thank you. The next question is, does conducting a pragmatic trial require a larger N in general?
Yes and no. Typically, because we are accepting a lot of noise in the pragmatic trial, we expect to need a larger N to be able to see the signal above the noise. There are times when the particular measurement that we're going to make is so much more relevant that we expect the signal to be much bigger than what we would measure for the efficacy trial, that we only need a similar size N. So the answer is, if we're looking for a large amount of signal in the noise, generally we need a bigger N. There are times when the signal we're looking for is a different signal to efficacy, and so our N gets smaller. And that bigger N is balanced by the greatly reduced cost for enrollment and recruitment and data collection.
Thank you. Next question is, other than the consent process, what are the additional considerations with regards to an IRB application for pragmatic trials?
So consent is always a very big challenge for the IRB, and that's balanced with the risk-benefit ratio. That's really what the IRB cares about, is does the risk of the study outweigh the benefit to some extent? Things they might care about are whether or not the trial has sufficient controls to draw a meaningful conclusion. And if one goes all in on practicality, it may not be possible to ever see a signal. So they might be concerned about that. But really, mostly they're concerned about the risk-benefit ratio. They're concerned about the consent process and whether or not it is appropriate. On occasion, I have seen a situation where we wanted to do a pragmatic trial where we would stop a practice that we thought was not beneficial. And because we were stopping a practice that we believed was not beneficial, the IRB's concern was, well, if you're not right, then you're stopping something that people are benefiting from, and we don't think that's okay. So whether you're adding something that you think is beneficial versus whether you're stopping something that you don't think is beneficial might just get different perceptions.
Thank you. And the last question I have for today is, in your experience, what are the settings that could most benefit from the inclusion of pragmatic trials?
That's a really, really good question, and a challenging one to answer. I believe that pragmatic trials can exist and should exist in almost every setting that we can think of. From the deployment of public health programs, to how we learn about education, to complementary and alternative therapeutic techniques, to the evaluation of different treatments in practice. I think they all have opportunities to benefit from pragmatic approaches, because in every domain, we really want to know, does it work in practice? And every setting is practice.
Great, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you again, and to remind our audience that for anybody who missed the presentation and who would like to send the presentation to anyone who might have missed it, I will be sending out a link to the recording following the presentation. So I want to say thanks again to Dr. Lindsell. Thank you to our audience for attending, and we hope to see you again on our next AARC webinar.
Thank you very much.